Welcome to episode 76 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of the episode at the show notes, which is www.7, all spelled out, so seven-health.com/76.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. It's another interview episode, and I'll be telling you about the guest in just one sec, but I want to make an announcement, and that announcement is that I'm currently taking on clients. So I announced this on last week's show, and I just want to mention it again. So I take on clients twice a year around January time and then in the July time, and I work with clients for a period of 5 months where we have a consult for an hour every 2 weeks. And I have clients all over the world, and consults are done via Skype or via FaceTime. So the fact that you're not based in the UK, if you're not based in the UK, which is where I am, it's not a problem. And more than half the people I work with are in Australia or Canada or the US or Germany or Saudi Arabia or other places around Europe or the world. So before working with anyone, we have a free chat and a free initial chat. And this just allows me to find out about your background, what's going on, what you're wanting to get out of working together. And it gives me the opportunity to explain how I work with clients and just how that process goes down. And basically, I want to see if we are the right fit for one another, because I only want to work with people who I truly believe that I can help and that are on the same page as me. And this chat just allows us to work that out. So if you are interested in finding out more, you can head over to the website, which is www.7, again, all spelled out, seven-health.com/help. So the word help, HELP, and it'll have more details there. And you can read through about more information of how I work with people. And at the bottom of the page, there's a link to apply for that free initial chat. And if you do that, I'll get back to you within 48 hours and we can arrange a time that works for both of us. And I only opened up my practice with the announcement of the show last week. And at the time of recording this intro, almost half those spots are gone. So within another week, maybe possibly 2 weeks max, I'll be closed again to new clients. So if you are struggling with lots of different things to do with your health or nutrition or body image or hormones, food issues, like the multitude of things that I talk about on this podcast or I write about, then head over to seven-health.com/help and get in contact. So with that announcement out of the way, God, I can't speak. With that announcement out of the way, let's focus on today's show. So today I'm bringing you an interview with Lara Briden. So Lara is a naturopathic doctor with nearly 20 years experience. She runs a busy hormone clinic in Sydney, Australia, and is the author of the book Period Repair Manual, Natural Treatment for Better Hormones and Better Periods. So I've been aware of Lara for quite a while now and would see her blog posts here and there and people sharing stuff on Facebook about her or her writing. And then towards the end of last year, I took on an intern to help out. She approached me and said she wanted to help me, and we're working together on different things. And one of the tasks that I set for her was to put together a list of podcast guests that I could interview, and with the topic of hormones in mind. And Lara was one of the names that she put on that list. And so you have Lauren, the intern, to thank for the recommendation. So undoubtedly more of the guests on the podcast will be because of her, but this is the first one that she recommended to me. So I really enjoyed this conversation with Lara. We cover a real wide range of topics, from the causes of things like heavy periods and acne and PMS. We talk a lot about different types of contraceptive methods and the pros and cons with different versions. And Lara actually mentions a couple of things that I didn't even know of existed. So I definitely learn a lot from this conversation. We also talk about PCOS and anovulatory cycles and estrogen dominance and just a real ton of stuff. One thing I do want to mention, and during the conversation, Lara does talk about cutting out all sugar from your diet for certain symptoms, and she includes in this category of sugar things like fruit juices and dates and dried fruit in this category. So we probably differ in our opinions about this, and I feel that sugar can be an issue when it's in excess or if it's causing a displacement of other foods in the diet. But as part of a well-rounded diet, I don't feel it is an issue, especially things like dates or orange juice. And just knowing sections of the audience who listen to this podcast, I don't want these comments to further fuel orthorexic tendency, which is the only reason I'm really mentioning it. But this really is just a very minor detail in what is a really incredible and helpful conversation that I know you're going to learn a lot from, because I definitely did. And Lara really is a wealth of knowledge on all things reproductive hormones. So with this very long intro out of the way, here is my conversation with Lara Briden. Hey, Lara, thanks for chatting with me today.
Hi, Chris. I'm glad to be here.
Cool. Well, look, I know it's fairly early for you, so thanks for agreeing to do this. You're in New Zealand and you're chatting very early morning, and it's night time for me, so thank you for taking the time.
Yep.
So to start off with, why don't you just give people a bit of a background on you and telling them how you got into what you're doing as a naturopath?
Yeah, great. Okay, so I trained as a naturopathic doctor about 20 years ago, and I just started out in general practice. But fairly quickly, I saw that most of the patients that were coming to me were women that needed help with period problems and various hormonal issues. So I just, over the last couple of decades, had an opportunity to learn what really works for those issues. And then a couple of years ago, I put that all together into a book called Period Repair Manual.
Okay. And I mean, for you then deciding all those years ago to become a naturopath, like what led up to that decision? What was like eating and food and stuff like in your household?
Oh, right. I see what you mean. Interesting question. Okay. So yeah, I grew up in quite a health conscious household, and, I don't think we didn't use a lot of natural medicine, but we certainly ate well, ate healthy. And when I was doing my science degree and trying to decide sort of what to do next, I contemplated doing conventional medicine, but it just didn't sort of fit with my background. And so I went on to study natural medicine.
Okay. And you studied, was it back in Canada?
Yeah, at the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine in Toronto.
Okay. And so what was it like I'm assuming that was back in the late 90s. What was it like during that time? Because, I mean, we're so far on from there, and I think being a nutritionist or being a naturopath is probably a lot more commonplace than it was back then. But how was it when you started out?
Yeah, so it was, I had some interesting conversations. I'm just thinking about some of the early conversations I had with some of the doctors in the small town where I started practicing to start with. For example, I was recommending probiotics, especially after antibiotics. That was something we learned in the, early mid-90s in my coursework. And that was not something that was on the radar for most people, or certainly for doctors at that time. They just, I remember one comment was, good bacteria, that's just quackery. So that was one of my favorite. Like from an early time, I learned to tolerate being called a quack.
Right. And so then, how did you make the transition? What brought you from Canada out to then New Zealand? Yeah,
so I moved to Sydney with my husband. My husband's from New Zealand, but he lived in Australia. So we lived there for about 14 or 15 years. And I ran quite a busy hormone clinic in Sydney, Australia, which I still run, actually. So I have this interesting life where I commute. I live in New Zealand, but I commute over to my clinic there every couple of months.
Okay. And you just do a couple of very busy days and then come back?
I do 10 days. 10 clinic days, and then come back, and then I Skype with my Sydney patients in between.
Okay, fine. And so in terms of the hormones and getting into that sort of thing, I know that's like a real interest of yours. Was that for personal reasons at all, or it was just those were the kinds of people who were showing up in your practice?
That was it. Exactly that. Those were the women that were coming, and they weren't, as you know, there aren't many answers or solutions from conventional medicine for period problems. So they needed something else. And I just could see from very early on that, diet and nutrition and herbal medicine works incredibly well for women's hormones. So I just embraced that.
And was that something that was very much taught in your course, and the information that you were using came directly from the course, or was stuff that you were then learning afterwards?
Yeah, I'd say a lot of it I've learned after. I mean, we have a lot more sort of knowledge in the last 20 years. It's hard to tease apart, how much of that I learned originally. But, as you know from my book, a lot of it's quite basic, so I'm going back to just explaining what a, women's menstrual cycle is and the importance of ovulation. And I think a lot of that I got from my basic coursework back then.
Okay. So look, you mentioned the book a couple of times, and I'd love to ask you some questions. And I know some of this is probably covered in the book, but for people who haven't read it, it'll give them a bit of an idea about it. And I want to go through some different symptoms, and maybe you can explain why they happen, or different reasons for why they happen, and if there's any herbal remedies that you would recommend alongside that, maybe you could make those suggestions.
Sure.
So the first one would be something like, say, heavy periods. So that's a common condition that I often see with clients. Like, what are some of the reasons that this could be happening?
Yeah, good question. I break it down into, there's two groups of women generally who experience heavy periods as teenagers, the heavy periods of teenagers, and I treat that differently than I do the other group, which is what can be very heavy periods of women in their 40s, approaching menopause and what's called perimenopause. Yeah. So, those are sort of two slightly different situations, but I'll first talk about maybe a commonality between them. There's a couple of just simple techniques I find that can lighten periods almost regardless of the underlying cause. And one is to remove dairy from the diet, remove cow dairy from the diet. I don't have an exact scientific mechanism as to why dairy makes periods heavier, but it does. And I think a lot of it's to do with the fact that can be for some people quite an inflammatory food. And so a higher level of chronic inflammation, one of the effects of that can be a heavier period. So that's simple. That works incredibly well for the teenage girls, especially. And then I look at the herbal medicine turmeric, which has quite a strong period lightening effect. And then for the younger group, for the girls, one thing to keep in mind is that they'll probably need some iron. Both groups will probably need some iron, which also helps to lighten periods. It's not just that they're iron deficient because they've been having periods, but iron itself can help to lighten periods. And then for the girls, it's just important to know that it's not going to last forever. It's usually just for the first sort of couple years of menstruation, and then their body calibrates to estrogen, and they start to ovulate and make another hormone called progesterone, which has quite a strong period lightening effect. And and often they'll be fine after that if they just get that little bit of help during the transition, and they can avoid going on hormonal birth control, which is really one of the doctor's only solutions for the problem of heavy periods in teenagers.
Yeah. And so then another symptom, and look, you mentioned the pill there, and it's something I want to chat with you about at some point, but I just want to go through some of these other symptoms. So sure. Acne is another common symptom. Like, what are the reasons that this can be happening, linking into reproductive hormones?
It's funny that we're trying to leave hormonal birth control to a later conversation, but I do have to say that a common experience is a post-pill or a pill withdrawal acne, which is probably one of the things I treat a lot these days with my own patients. It's women, struggling, trying to get off the pill and finding they've got acne worse than they ever had it before. A lot of that's just the withdrawal from a couple of the drugs in hormonal birth control, which kind of create a dependency in the skin. So that requires some management, and also, again, some reassurance that it's not going to last forever. Yeah. But one of the nutrients that works really well for skin, I'm just writing a blog post right now on the mineral zinc. Yeah. Because a lot of us are zinc deficient, kind of without realizing it. It's, it can be difficult to absorb. It's only found really well in high doses in sort of animal products, so if in meats, and so if you might have a young woman who's vegetarian and just not, and eating a lot of grains, which can prevent the absorption of zinc, and she would find herself quite zinc deficient, and that one of the outcomes of that is breakouts or acne. And it's quite a simple solution, really, when someone needs zinc and you give it, that can have a good effect on skin. The other big thing for skin is diet, though, and primarily removing sugar from the diet. So by sugar, I mean desserts, as in, ice cream and cakes, but also date balls and fruit juice, and all the concentrated sugars can have quite a strong effect on worsening acne.
Okay. And I know, just in terms of you mentioning the zinc side of things, that especially, with zinc, it's so important for so many functions. So it's important for reproduction, it's important for healthy skin, it's important for immune function, and especially when kids are going through that stage of growth and coming into first getting their period, etc., that can be a really bad time for acne, because zinc is just being called on for so many different functions within the body. Yeah,
that's a great way to think about it. Yeah, their zinc stores would perhaps be depleted more than usual because their body's using it just to make hormones, basically.
Yeah. So another one would be like PMS, which is really common, and maybe you just starting out by defining what PMS is, and then some reasons why it's going on, and then some suggestions for what to do to deal with it. Yeah, so
premenstrual syndrome is quite. It actually has quite a nebulous definition. Unfortunately, it's a real phenomenon. I think a number of women do experience a worsening. Primarily, I guess it would be defined as a worsening of mood in the sort of 10 to 12 days leading up to the period. That can be accompanied with physical symptoms such as, breast swelling, tenderness, sort of fluid retention, food cravings. One thing I'll just say at this point, it's normal for women to be hungrier leading up to their period. That's just a message that I'm trying to put out there. That's partly from, progesterone has an appetite stimulating effect. I think that's allowed. I like to give women permission to eating more is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as it's not eating, sugar or inflammatory foods that might be harming the body.
Sorry, I just want to stop you. There's a really good graph that I saw that looked at a basal metabolic rate throughout a woman's cycle, and you can actually notice it goes up towards the latter part. So just the basic metabolic rate, so the metabolic functions that are going on within the body are increasing towards that latter stage. So it's then not that surprising that someone is hungrier. And that could be driven by progesterone and other hormones, but that's like physiologically what is going on. So I'm the same. I'm always encouraging clients, like, the last 3-5 days before your period is probably the point that you should be eating the most at any point throughout the cycle.
Yeah, I'd love to see that graph. I think part of it is, it's interesting about the metabolism, because progesterone stimulates thyroid. So that's why temperature goes up in the second half of the cycle. That's great. I agree with that. But at the same time, I don't think women should have to, suffer some of the other symptoms that they do, which is, the irritability and maybe, insomnia and it's quite, one of the things I say in my book, and I've said quite often to patients, is PMS is one of my favorite things to treat, because it responds so well and so quickly, and, gives such a, high reward factor for, a little bit of effort.
Yeah.
There's a few strategies, but one really simple one, not to be too simplistic about it, but this is one thing that even just a simple supplement can help quite a lot. So the combination of magnesium and vitamin B6 has a strong effect on PMS. It's almost like a, magic pill. I think it's doing a few things. It increases the levels of a neurotransmitter called GABA, in the body, which is quite a calming, soothing neurotransmitter. And it helps with the production, and that same nutrient combination helps with the production of progesterone, and it reduces inflammation. So it's just quite a simple thing that women can do. And they can, with that one, they can actually even just take it during PMS. They can take it throughout the month, or they can just take it when they need it. So that's one of my frontline treatments.
Okay.
I also, as with any period problem, any health problem, I also look at removing inflammatory foods from the diet. So again, looking at sugar, looking at cow dairy, looking at just, processed food, junk foods, removing those or reducing those, and that would need to be done throughout all of the cycle, can give you the reward of, much less PMS, sort of an easier time.
Right. And is that like a blanket statement for most people that they should be removing like sugar and dairy, or you think it's important for some people and not so important for others?
The sugar, I'd make a blanket statement, but although it's certainly for some women, it's much more crucial. The cow dairy, no. I think some women can tolerate cow dairy. It seems to be about, I don't think anyone's done the science on this, but it seems to be about maybe a little less than half of people, in my experience, people who are reacting quite badly to dairy. So, there's certainly people out there who can get away with dairy and not experience the inflammation from it.
Okay. And look, so now let's have a bit of a chat about the pill. So I've read your book, I've read your blog, and I get the impression you are not the biggest fan of the birth control pill. Are you able to just kind of outline some of your concerns and why you're not the biggest fan?
Yeah. Well, I'll begin by saying certainly I feel like women, have the right to take that as a method of birth control if that's what they want to do. But my message is that I do want women to understand what it is that they're taking. So I think the most important thing to understand is that the hormonal birth control, all types, not just the pill, but the injection, the NuvaRing, the implant, and all the pills, work by shutting down women's hormones completely. It essentially induces a kind of menopausal state, and then it acts as a hormone replacement, kind of not dissimilar to the hormone replacement that women would take after menopause. And those are the steroid drugs in hormonal birth control are not true hormones. They're not estrogen and progesterone that your body would make. There are other molecules called levonorgestrel and drospirenone, and they have different effects on the body than your body's own hormones. And one of the things that distresses me the most, the side effect that I've encountered the most and that I've been most worried about, is the effect on mood, which makes sense because steroid hormones have a powerful effect on the brain. And I would argue that estrogen and progesterone generally have quite a beneficial effect on the brain. Progesterone so affects the brain so strongly, it can be classified essentially as a neurotransmitter. It also interacts with what are called GABA receptors, so the calming receptors in the brain. And the synthetic progestins, they're not progesterone, it's like levonorgestrel, and those molecules do not have the same effect. They actually have the opposite effect and have been potentially shown to cause anxiety. There was so this year, kind of around middle of 2016, last year, there was a Danish study that came out where the team looked at 1.4 million women over 10 years, and they made a very clear correlation between hormonal birth control, all types, and anxiety and depression. And which didn't surprise me at all. What surprised me was, that it wasn't affecting more women than they found it to be. So I guess that's one of my biggest concerns because it's prescribed so frequently, and not just for birth control, but it's prescribed now as this kind of one size fits all way to supposedly fix any kind of period problem, although it doesn't fix it in any sense of the word. The way it fixes it is by shutting it all down.
Yeah. And I think one of the big things is as well is people refer to estrogen and progesterone as reproductive hormones, but as you've talked about there in terms of mood, like their effects are body wide and they have such a knock-on effect within all the different systems. And when you start playing around with that, the symptoms can then be pretty body wide.
Absolutely. It affects insulin metabolism, thyroid, muscle mass, digestion. Those hormones affect the microbiome, which are the good intestinal bacteria. It's really, as you say, there's almost no part of the body that's not affected. And it's time for us to stop thinking of kind of women's hormones as a sort of side issue or they're fully integrated into our health.
Yeah. And what I'll do, I'll link to an article in the show notes in regards to that Danish study. There was a really great article that I shared last year. I think it was in The Guardian, all about that study. So I'll put it in the show notes so people can then check that out. And one of the things that you also repeatedly say, and I've seen you say this in the book and you've said it on your blog as well, is that pill bleeds are not the same as natural periods. And I really want you to explain that because I think this is an important concept for people to get.
Yeah. So there is no need there's no medical reason to bleed monthly when on hormonal birth control. The only reason the drug companies dose it that way is to reassure women that it's in some way kind of similar to their natural cycle, which it's not. So a natural cycle is defined as not the bleed, but what the ovaries are doing. So a roughly 30-day cycle, and of course it's normal for a women's cycle to be anywhere between 21 to 35 days. But a period that's coming roughly at an interval, that interval means that ovulation is occurring. So it means that the ovaries are doing their main event, which is to make estrogen and then make progesterone after ovulation. And that's why women want a regular cycle, is because of ovulation. Excuse me, not because of there's any reason, the bleeding itself without ovulation is meaningless.
Yeah. And I think, was it you? Yeah, it probably was you that was saying, like, historically the reason why you were having the monthly bleed was to do with the fact that you couldn't prescribe the birth control pill to prevent pregnancy.
Yeah.
It was more to do with regulating hormones, or like there's some kind of weird loophole historically around it.
Yeah, in the early days, like in the early 60s, when it was just sort of, they were still negotiating the legality of it for contraception, it was prescribed purportedly to, I think regulate periods or normalize periods. It was just a little wink, wink, kind of, this is what we're doing, but not really. But then somehow, strangely, over the last 50 years, that's kind of become the normal. I mean, there's the one statement I just cannot tolerate is if a doctor gives the pill to, quote, regulate periods, because that does not mean anything. I mean, it's, I guess it's valid to take hormonal birth control to prevent pregnancy. It's valid to, it can work to suppress acne, although the acne will be way worse after, or, suppress other symptoms, suppress hormones, but it doesn't regulate periods.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I have the same conversation with clients as well. And so, look, if someone was going to go on some form of hormonal contraceptive, like, do you have a preference?
Well, I used to say the Mirena IUD, just because in my thinking, the dose is much lower. It supposedly works mostly within the uterus, and less of the leave-in gestrel, that's the drug, the progestin drug, less of that is reaching the bloodstream, which, seemed to me to be a better option. And also it doesn't work by, unlike all the other types of hormonal birth control, it does not work by shutting down hormones. It doesn't suppress ovulation completely. So I thought, well, at least women are still able to get a little bit of their own estrogen, their own progesterone, which they need for bones and muscle and mood and everything like that. But then the Mirena, the IUD actually did quite badly in the Danish study, which has sort of given me a little bit of pause. What we're finding now in that and some other studies is that quite a lot of the progestin drug does reach the bloodstream. So It seems to be, enough to cause problems. Yeah. So
Okay.
So I guess I would say this: I'm not enamored by any type of hormonal birth control.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts then on, say, like the copper coil?
Yeah, well, it's quite different. So it's not hormonal at all. It works just by the copper ions impair sperm, and it also works to prevent implantation. I think it's a reasonable option. A lot of my experience is, strangely, at least in Australia, a lot of young women have never even heard of the coil or the IUD. So I think we might just say a word as to what that is exactly. It's a little sort of copper structure. It looks like about the shape of an earring or the size of an earring that the doctor inserts through the cervix into the uterus. It's not surgery. It's just done. It just takes, less than a minute in the doctor's rooms. And sometimes they'll give, some pain relief or, sometimes a local anesthetic, but it's fairly non-invasive that way in terms of insertion. And once it's in, it can stay. The copper IUD can stay in for 10 years or more. There's nothing else sort of to do or take, which I know a lot of women like that aspect of it.
Okay. And do you see any issues in terms of copper toxicity? Because, I've had women who have had the copper coil and it hasn't worked particularly well. And once they've had it removed, things have greatly improved for them. So I have some slight concerns with that as a method. I don't know how it stacks up against the others. But yeah, that's something I've noticed. I just wanted to get your opinion on it.
Yeah. Were your clients reporting anxiety? Was that
Yes. So,
yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll say a couple things about that. So one study out of Mexico has looked at, finally, took women seriously and actually measured copper levels in the blood of IUD users versus non-IUD users. And they did find that, there is a slightly elevated level of copper. And yes, copper can contribute to mood and anxiety. So I certainly think about that. I think it's not to be dismissed. Just to put it in context, it would be a very small amount, and we get copper from food as well. So, I think a couple squares of dark chocolate potentially has more copper than would be released from a copper IUD per day. But another thing is just, I've said this on a couple other podcasts, and nobody's studied this or nobody's asked the question of why do IUDs in some women cause anxiety? And so that's true of the hormonal IUD as well, right? And I feel I am starting to wonder or think if in some women there's just a physical kind of almost reflex or nervous system reflex against having something in the uterus because the body is all connected. We have nerves that connect all the parts. And I think maybe for some women that just doesn't feel good. And so I accept that, I certainly don't think it's for everyone, but there are a lot of women out there who don't experience that side effect and do like it. And actually the copper IUD has, my understanding of the research is it has the highest user satisfaction rate of any method in terms of, more women of the users, people who use it, they're happy with it. And it beats out hormonal birth control in that parameter. So
okay,
it should be it's on the menu, I think, as an option.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any, within this topic of, I know you've obviously got your own book, but are there other particular books that you really like or have had a big impact on you, or even practitioners that you really like or recommend in respect to hormonal health?
Oh, yeah. Well, of course. Sorry. I have to mention Holly Grigg-Spall, who I think wrote that Guardian article that you're talking about. She wrote a book called Sweetening the Pill. It's going to be a film. They're making it into a documentary. She's from the UK.
Okay.
So
I'm somehow on that Facebook page because I see stuff come up in my news feed. So it probably is from that Guardian article.
Yeah, it's probably her. You can see her story on her blog and her book. She was a user of hormonal birth control and then just started learning some things about it and wrote a book. And she's very connected with lots of other people, in the field, lots of other women and activists and people talking about it. So that's a great resource. There's some other ones out there. I guess one of the places I look at quite a lot is there's a site, a Canadian site called the Center for Ovulation Research, and there's an endocrinologist there, Dr. Geraldine Pryor, and they've put out, she's put out a couple books, and they have some blog posts just talking about what I was saying earlier, the value of ovulation and how that's, how women make hormones. And I would say actually reading some of her stuff has been perhaps quite a big influence on my thinking about it as well. I'd like to just mention a couple other contraceptive methods, if that's okay, just to give your listeners the full picture.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you then about the fertility awareness-based method. So, go through the whole spectrum if you'd like.
Yeah. Okay, so then there's the barrier methods, which are male condoms, female condoms, and also the what's called the diaphragm and a similar structure called the cervical cap are making a comeback. That's a barrier method that a woman can use, where she inserts this kind of soft latex little cup over the cervix. It comes with instructions. I mean, it needs to be used with a sort of a gel to create a seal, and needs to be left in for a certain number of hours after sex. But the modern ones, I mean, in the old days, diaphragms needed fitting by a doctor, and it was all just a bit more complicated and cumbersome. But the new ones, I think, are sort of a bit more user-friendly.
Yeah.
And then, I guess and then there's another method coming for men, which I'm hoping is coming soon. I believe it's under clinical trials right now. It's called vasal gel. Okay. It's not available yet, but it's a barrier method of sorts. It's an injection. So the doctor would put an injection into what are called the vas deferens, which are the little tubes that connect the sperm to the semen, and that would just be not surgery, but just a little in-office injection that can be left there for as long until the man wants to have children, and then a second injection to wash it away. So it's like a vasectomy, but it's reversible. Okay. And so once we can determine, that that's safe, and I think that potentially could be a game changer for a lot of people for birth control.
Yeah, I haven't actually heard of that. So that sounds really interesting, because I guess from the little that you said there, that's then not going to interfere with the hormones.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, that would be perfect.
No, it shouldn't affect a man's hormones at all. So, that's interesting. And I think humans are smart. I think there's potentially some other things coming down the line, some new inventions in birth control. It's a bit weird when you think about it that, we invented this very crude instrument of hormonal birth control back in the 50s, 60s, and we haven't really moved on from that yet. I mean, we've in so many other parts of our, world, we have new technology, new inventions, and I think it's time for contraception to catch up with that. But then you mentioned fertility awareness methods. So that's my first choice for patients. It's based on the fact that women are fertile for only 6 days per cycle. So men are fertile every day. Women are fertile for about 6 days. So it's just the matter of figuring out which 6 days. And that requires some thought and some objective measurements. You cannot simply just estimate that or guesstimate that based on a period app or a calendar, or we know that doesn't work. So there needs to be the measure there's two measures that can be used to try to estimate that. One is cervical fluid or discharge. I've learned to read that, the changes that happen just before ovulation. And then the other one that has to be used is body temperature, because of the fact that our basal body temperature rises after ovulation. We can use that. So women can learn to track that. They need some training, whether it's from a book. There's a book out there called Taking Charge of Your Fertility that I believe is a how-to manual for fertility awareness method of birth control. Or you can learn, from a person in an online course setting or something like that. Yeah. And then there's another device which I am quite a big fan of called Daysy, which is it's a German medical device that in Germany is approved for contraception. And they claim, I believe it's 99.4% efficacy rate or accuracy rate, which is excellent, is in the range of efficacy in the same range as copper, almost as copper IUD, in the same range as hormonal birth control. And it does everything for you. So all you have to do is take your temperature in the morning, and the computer's built right into the thermometer, and it will then, after a few cycles, it will, start to give you a green, yellow, or red light. And if it gives you a green light, then you know confidently to 99.4% that you're in your not fertile time and that you can have unprotected sex. So it's quite, I think women love it. I mean, I recommend it all the time. So I'm starting to, over the next couple of years, get some feedback from my own patients.
Okay. But that's the first time I've heard of that. So is it just on body temperature alone, or is it? Okay.
Which is a bit controversial in the fertility awareness method. Do you teach fertility awareness method, Chris?
I'm aware of it, and I talk about it a little bit with clients, and I'll get clients to be keeping body temperature and that kind of thing. And the reason I'm quite surprised about what you say there is, yes, I notice that there will be changes for a lot of women between the first half and the second half of the cycle, but that's not always as I would expect. And it can be a lot messier for a lot of people than what I would think to get to 99.4% accuracy.
So they've addressed that. So the fertility awareness method community was one of their first sort of questions about this device, about Daysy, was the fact that they don't use mucus, so that fertile fluid observation, so potentially could miss the possibility of an early ovulation. But what they use is the little computer algorithm, which is now been learned basically from the data from millions of women over 30 years. And it's one thing to keep in mind. I mean, it would never, with a new user, it would never give a green light in the first part of the cycle, like until for the first few months, and until it had kind of learned the cycle. So they've, it's to do with their algorithm, and they've blogged, but they have a blog. And so rather than kind of, getting that from me, I just encourage your listeners perhaps to just go and have a look at the Daysy site and some of the blogs about that specific question and about the computer algorithm.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And with your clients, when they're using it, how many cycles roughly does it take before they're able to get to a point where it's pretty reliable?
Well, they start to see green lights after 2 to 3 cycles, but I think then after 6 or more cycles, they're going to be seeing more green lights. I mean, potentially someone could get more than potentially almost 3 weeks of green light, but that it wouldn't do that until it was fairly confident until it was confident of the cycle.
Sure. And is there is there a cycle length that someone has to be between? Because one of the methods that I've recommended before to people was, I think it's Persona, where it's that's more looking at like luteinizing hormone and that side of things. But I know with that, you have to be something like a minimum of 21 days and a maximum of 35 days, and you have to be fairly regular with your cycles for it to work pretty well. Like, is that the same thing with this method?
No, they don't have that requirement.
Okay.
But one thing I'll say is, you just said at the 21 to 35. Okay, so the reason that gets discussed is a cycle, supposedly, a period that's coming more often than 21 days or less often than 35 days, is not likely to be what's called an ovulatory cycle.
Sure.
So it is. And so in that case, if you can still bleed periodically, but not have ovulated, that's called an anovulatory cycle. And for health, that's quite important. It's obviously quite important for future fertility because there's no ovulation, and it makes it almost impossible to get proper readings with a fertility awareness method. So basically, if someone's having anovulatory cycles where they don't ovulate, they're never going to see a green light. Like, they're never going to get, like, the method's never going to be able to tell them you're in a safe zone.
Yeah.
So in that way, I mean, they could use Daysy, they could sort of rely on it, but they're just never going to, until they do something to start ovulating regularly and getting that more kind of classic cycle, they're probably not going to sort of get much happiness from that.
Sure.
So so my big mantra with my blog and my book is, do you ovulate? And if not, then how can you start to ovulate? It's the key issue for women's health.
Okay. And are you, with your clients, are you testing to see that they're ovulating? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I might do a progesterone test, but also temperatures themselves. I mean, whether someone's relying on temperatures for contraception or just maybe, as you mentioned with your clients, just looking at them to see if ovulation is occurring and, when it's occurring and how long the second half of the cycle, that what's called the luteal phase, lasts. That's a scientifically proven, definitive measure of ovulation is that temperature rise.
Yeah. Okay. And I know with the Daysy, you don't need to be looking at vaginal mucus, but do you want to just chat a little about this? Because I think this is, if someone is doing that fertility awareness-based method, that is something that is important. And can it just be useful for someone who's, say, wanting to actually conceive and just being more aware of where their body's at and how fertile they are at different points?
Yeah, that's the other use of fertility awareness method is to reverse it, and rather than using it to avoid pregnancy, use it to reach pregnancy.
Yeah,
it's called body literacy or body awareness.
Yeah. Do you want to just talk about the different changes that someone could see with the mucus and what they would be looking for when they're like fertile versus not fertile?
Yeah, exactly. Women will typically see about 2 to 3 days before ovulation, we'll see a new kind of vaginal discharge that is quite unique. It looks it's quite watery and slippery. It looks like, what I say to my patients, it looks like raw egg white. And that forms under the presence of it, that forms from the estrogen surge that typically happens at that part of the cycle. So it's a good indication that ovulation is about to happen, because that's, in a normal cycle, the ovulation surge comes first and then ovulation a few days later. But one thing to keep in mind, it's not seeing that the presence of that fertile fluid or cervical fluid is not a guarantee of ovulation. It really just means estrogen, a lot of estrogen. So women can see that even in what's called an anovulatory cycle, even if they're something like PCOS where they're not perhaps ovulating, they can still see the mucus. So it's sort of worth, and I discuss that in my book, just understanding that. And then after ovulation, typically that all dries up. Progesterone would dry up any fertile mucus, and sort of quite a bit of usually less discharge in the second half of the cycle. Okay.
And I mean, you mentioned they're having higher amounts of estrogen. I mean, I know estrogen dominance is not a term that you like. I think there was a blog post about why you're not a fan of that term. But I think even if you're not a fan of that term, I think it is something that does happen for people. Do you want to just explain then like what that is and how that then affects someone's cycle?
Sure. So the term estrogen dominance is used to mean too much estrogen and not enough progesterone. And certainly, as you say, that's a situation that women can find themselves in. But it can happen for different reasons. And so I like to kind of break it down a bit more and just think about those two hormones separately. So first of all, think about estrogen excess and why that might be happening. And it's a few different situations. One common one is, again, back to women in our 40s during perimenopause, where estrogen can be double what it was when we were younger. So that's one of the reasons that women in their 40s can experience quite heavy periods, a lot of breast pain, and that's coming from sort of a hyper release of estrogen from the ovaries. So that requires extra work to help the body to detoxify and clear the estrogen. And that is done primarily through the liver and through the bowel. So the intestinal bacteria play a big role in the healthy removal of estrogen from the body. So I find that that's clinically quite important. So, for example, after someone's had maybe a course of antibiotics, they might find in the next 2 to 3 menstrual cycles that they're experiencing more symptoms of excess estrogen, for example. So that, that's then the use of probiotics and, healthy diet for the intestinal bacteria, ensuring a bowel motion every day, that can really help with estrogen excess. Alcohol is another thing that can worsen estrogen excess. So I do think that's a topic I'd like to blog about more in the future. I think as women, well, as humans, but as women in particular, we sort of need to perhaps, take a second look at alcohol and realize that it's not friendly to hormonal health. So that's the estrogen side of things. And then progesterone deficiency is common, and it's all about ovulation. So there are many situations in which a woman she still might be having occasional bleeds, but she's not ovulating. That can happen with something called polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. Typically has anovulatory cycles, and also, again, back to, in our 40s, during perimenopause, ovulation becomes less common. And so most women in their 40s could probably use more progesterone than we have. So,
and is there any stats just in terms of women in their 40s where, like, out of every 10 cycles, you're only ovulating X amount of times? Have they done any investigation into that? Like how often or how common they start to become within their 40s?
Very good question. I don't believe so. No, I don't believe anyone has asked that specific question about perimenopause, but I do know that the endocrinologist I mentioned earlier, Dr. Geraldine Pryor, she did do a study. I think it covered women of various ages, and discovered that it was quite high. It was like even just like a younger woman, like having fairly regular, even 28-day cycles, that a reasonable number of the time, I think it was like a quarter of the cycles or something like that, are anovulatory cycles, which was quite surprising to her as an endocrinologist and quite interesting. So I think, it doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think it's certainly happening. And I can observe that with my patients. I can see that they're not, with some of my women in their 40s, they're just not ovulating. They're having these crazy heavy periods and no sign. They might see some of the fertile mucus, but they're not getting a temperature rise. They're not, another symptom of an anovulatory cycle is a lot of spotting before the period, kind of a bit of show happening leading up to it. That means that no progesterone has been made. Okay,
fine. Well, it's really interesting what you say about the study. It would be interesting to find out what was the makeup of that group. To have those kind of results that sounds. I'm definitely going to look into that study.
I'll get this. I'll find the link for you. Yep.
Okay, perfect. And like the final thing I just want to mention or want you to chat about was like PCOS. So maybe like describing what the acronym stands for people who aren't aware of it, and like what it is. And then I know in the book you've talked about that there are 3 different types. So looking into that.
Yep. So it stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome. And it's been a very confusing name. So there's serious talk of changing the name, and soon, because the name polycystic ovarian syndrome implies that the condition is something to do with, somehow caused by something gone wrong in the ovaries or potentially cysts in the ovaries, and none of that is true. It's a hormonal condition. Well, it's not even, a really important message is I want to get across is it's not one condition. It's what's called an umbrella diagnosis. So so women can, for various reasons, not ovulate regularly. That's basically kind of what it comes down to. There's kind of a couple criteria. So not ovulating regularly, and plus making excess male hormones, or what are called androgens. It's quite a common situation for women. And those 2 criteria are the kind of the core of the diagnosis of PCOS. And so that's why the condition or conditions are associated with problems like excess body hair and facial hair and skin breakouts. That's from the testosterone or the other male hormones. And that can happen for different reasons. Probably about 70% of women who end up with that diagnosis, the reason it's happening is because of an underlying problem with insulin or what's called metabolic syndrome or pre-diabetes. So that's why, and that's what you'll read about the most, is sort of strategies to improve the insulin sensitivity, removing sugar from the diet, increasing exercise. And the conventional approach would be to use a diabetic drug called metformin, which can work. I mean, it certainly is. It's a fairly targeted treatment for the condition. But I'll say to you, it doesn't work as well as diet and exercise. That's my experience.
Yeah. And did you say, and then there's some other types of PCOS?
Yeah. So I think what happens is other women, sort of about 30% of the other women who end up with this diagnosis have come there for a different reason. For one thing, they may not actually have PCOS. I feel like there's a lot of confusion over the diagnosis. For example, some doctors have been diagnosing it just based on the ultrasound finding of polycystic ovaries, and that is not accurate. That is not a diagnostic technique for the condition at all. And we know from the research that women with PCOS can have polycystic ovaries. Women without PCOS can have polycystic ovaries. Women on the pill can have polycystic. Like the appearance of polycystic ovaries on its own doesn't really mean anything. So the first step is to kind of look at how the diagnosis was made, and if it was just based on ultrasound, then kind of to look a bit further and think about whether that diagnosis is valid.
Yeah.
But
and I think to interrupt you, I think that is really important, because there's lots of clients that I've seen who've been diagnosed with that. And then I asked about, okay, so tell me about the other hormone tests that they did. And they're like, oh, I don't think they did any hormone tests. It's like, okay, what symptoms that you have that would point towards high amounts of testosterone or other androgens? And they're like, oh, I don't really have any. And so, yes, it's been simply because there's been lots of cysts or follicles on the ovary that the diagnosis has been made, but without actually looking at the androgens and testosterone to really give a proper diagnosis.
Exactly, because they're not cysts exactly. Just to clarify, they're as you say, they're follicles. They're undeveloped follicles or eggs, of which the ovary is full of eggs. The ovary is full of follicles. That's what an ovary is. An ovary has cysts by its very nature. But what matters, kind of what determines a healthy ovary, is that it, as it's moving every cycle towards ovulation, it should have, sort of a certain number of follicles that are still undeveloped, and then a few that are developed, and eventually, what's called a dominant follicle. So that's how an ovary would look in someone who is ovulating. And one thing to say is that we know now, and this is just fairly new, that this has come into the conversation, about younger women, like teenagers and women in their early 20s, have more follicles. Always, by definition, that's just the way their ovaries are. So they need, if someone was going to be making the claim of polycystic or too many follicles, it needs to be age appropriate, for one thing. And that's led to a lot of confusion.
And I mean, I think using the word cyst is also confusing, because, as you say, like, it is follicles, and you should have those on there in differing stages. Like, yes, they should be reabsorbed at some point, but at any one stage, you're going to have a certain number on there.
Exactly. And at the same time, there are what are called abnormal ovarian cysts, where they grow too large, or they kind of, it's probably like about 20 different kinds of an ovarian cyst, either a functional one, or some of them are pathological. So it's the term ovarian cyst is actually refers to a lot of different things, and I don't think it's not appropriate to be used with PCOS, because, as we said, they're not cysts; they're really just small eggs.
Yeah. Okay, well, Lara, I'm loving this conversation, but I'm also conscious of the time. So, look, before I bring this to a close, where can people be going to connect with you or find out more information? And I'm going to put everything in the show notes, but you can just tell people now. And if there is anything you have coming up or anything you want to promote, then feel free to do so.
Yeah, great. So they can find me at my blog, larabriden.com, and on social media, it's just the same. It's at Lara Briden on Twitter and Instagram. and Facebook. And then my book is Period Repair Manual, which is available from, most people buy it through Amazon, I think. It's Amazon and some of the other sort of big online bookstores. I have a new blog post coming up. Hopefully by the time I'm not sure. I'm sure when your podcast is coming out, but I'm just writing something about zinc today, which would tie in well with our conversation today.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll if it's going to work out, I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, great.
Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know you've given people loads of valuable information, and they're going to really benefit from it.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Yeah, it was a great conversation.